crisis, there was a $500 million budget shortfall. Now, that's a massive amount of money when you're talking about an organization whose global budget is around $4 to $5 billion, or let's say $4 billion. And in 2008, because of the international financial crisis and member states not fulfilling their responsibilities to give money, their dues, to fund the World Health Organization, there were at least 20% staff cuts in 2008. Of the current $3.99 billion, 80% of that budget is earmarked by member states. And what that means, when you say earmarked, what that means is that the money can only be spent on the thing that the member state wants it to be spent on. So in Canada, for example, we say we give all sorts of money to the WHO, but a significant portion of that money is dedicated to Stephen Harper's hobby horse, maternal child health. And that's where it goes. It doesn't go to where the Director General of the World Health Organization sees as the priority area. It goes where the member state earmarks it to go. So 80% of that budget is earmarked. Therefore, there's very little control, in fact, over an operational agenda. And now, since 2012, the WHO has had to eliminate more than 300 jobs. And the majority of those jobs have been in outbreak and crisis response programs. So there has been at least 50% funding cuts in outbreak and crisis response programs within the WHO, and at least 66% staff cuts since 2012. So those are what I would call serious constraints. And when one is faced with an epidemic like Ebola, they have obvious implications. Now, there are also organizational pathologies, what people call organizational pathologies. And we see that for example, the WHO is without any flexibility at all and is completely subject to the whims of donors and to the whims of member states. It doesn't have any autonomy in terms of how it designs and structures its budget and therefore its program. As well, Margaret Chan said that she was only informed in June of a deficient regional response 2 months after MSF's latest warnings. Now, in the first instance, that clearly indicates an organizational dysfunction. If the Director General is unaware of a major problem like Ebola and of organizational failure over an extended period of time, that is an organizational management problem. The other thing that it indicates to me is that Margaret Chan does not read the newspaper. So there are serious issues here in terms of how policy is formulated, how policy is applied, how the organization actually runs its operations, how it manages its surveillance systems, and so on and so on. As I've already alluded to, it was only in August that it declared a public health emergency of international concern. It was reluctant to declare that emergency, some argue, because of fear of overreacting. And it had been accused of overreacting using the international health regulations in the 2009 swine flu episode. And it also had been, in that period, it felt that its reputation was really at stake. And part of that reputational damage was around it being seen to be too cozy with the vaccine makers for swine flu. And so at this point, with Ebola, WHO was very reluctant and very hesitant to take risks, or what it saw as risks, without firm evidence. And then, as we've seen, there was an evidence chain failure. There was simply the knowledge and information was simply not moving up through the architecture of the organization. So these represent serious problems. Now, the international health regulations are another key component of governance in relation to the WHO and in relation to Ebola. I could give a week-long seminar on the IHRs, as I know Ross could, but let me just use one slide. And here it is. The international health regulations are designed to prevent national health emergencies from developing into international crises. They emerged out of the experience of the SARS epidemic. And the basic concept, the basic informing concept was to identify, isolate, and contain at the point of origin, as opposed to respond externally by closing borders and closing trade, but to identify, isolate, and contain at the point of origin, and then at subsequent points of outbreak. And that was the thinking. And now with Ebola, many people are calling for reform of the IHRs. They should be changed. They're going to be made stronger. Well, they have never actually been enforced. In 2005, the IHRs came into quote-unquote force, but by 2012, 193 nations had applied for extensions on the implementation of the IHRs. So they're still not in actual functional force. And so to engage in a process of revision would be folly at its worst. They're good regulations, they work, and the basic concept needs to be applied. There are issues around enforcement, and there are issues around incentives and accountability incentives that could be addressed. But those are a component of the regulations. Now, the other key issue that is very, very clear is that the Ebola epidemic the response to the Ebola epidemic has largely been a charity-based response. In the early phases, right through until October of last year. And that is despite an $18 billion a year funding pool to global humanitarian assistance. What happened for the international humanitarian response was that it too was slow, bureaucratic, under-resourced, uncoordinated. And MSF was in effect, the only organization actually doing concrete delivery of services. And it was overwhelmed, and it repeatedly stated that it was overwhelmed. Now, one of the other key challenges is, governance challenges, is sustained interest and funding interest and political interest in the epidemic. This is taken from the OCHA website yesterday, which is and this basically says that OCHA and the WHO and UN agencies have requested $2.27 billion to deal with the ongoing containment efforts around Ebola through to next year, through to June, I believe, of next year. They have only received only 57% of that request has been pledged, and an even lesser amount has actually been received. Now, this is pretty characteristic, I can tell you, of humanitarian assistance. When there's a famine, when there's a situation of massive refugee displacement, let's say that you've got situation X, there's an assessment of these are the services, the things that need to happen, it will cost $1 billion. What's fairly characteristic is that you will, on a good day, end up with about 60% of your request actually being funded, which means that the other 40% doesn't get funded and therefore doesn't get done. Right? So this is about what I think one can typically expect in terms of Ebola. Now, the other key set of issues that's important to recognize is that the Ebola epidemic did not emerge in a global health vacuum. Right? There is a system of sorts It's deeply dysfunctional in many ways, but it's also deeply functional in many other ways. One of the key challenges in global health is governance, and it's not, that challenge is not unique to health. It is a global challenge. It affects issues like energy policy, climate change, international finance, emerging, re-emerging infectious diseases, agricultural policy. These are critical global governance challenges. And many people argue, myself included, that we're at a point where we have multiple converging crises and where we are failing abysmally to deal with these. So much so that it's not the crisis or the crises that are the number one crisis, but the number one crisis, in fact, is governance. It's how do we actually think about a problem? How do we think about working in an apparent chaos of apparent anarchic states? How do we work to achieve a common end? And that, I think, is the core governance challenge. And global health is just simply yet another domain where those governance challenges accrue. Now, a fantastic study was done and published in the Lancet Commission and the University of Oslo Commission on Global Governance for Health. It was published last year. And if you're interested in this, and in fact, I would actually make it required reading for anyone in public health. But you really need to understand this. It's vitally important to understanding the context in which previously construed public health technical knowledge is actually applied. The context is everything. Louis Pasteur once said, and we all know who Louis Pasteur is, he once said, the microbe is nothing, the context is everything. Right? So, and it's very, very true, and particularly in this regard. And so this report has highlighted a number of different areas, including a democratic deficit, weak accountability structures, institutional stickiness, which essentially means that there's path dependency